organizations awarding the contracts showed a frequent disregard for federal contracting and procurement policies and guidance. We also found that each organization's own practices often did not demonstrate value for money. We felt that it wasn't necessary to repeat recommendations that had just been issued by the procurement ombuds or by internal audit shops and the Controller General, who had released reports over the last year related to McKinsey. Many of our recommendations would have been focused on follow the existing rules.
Canada's Auditor General there slamming the federal government and bureaucrats after reviewing 97 contracts worth $209 million, that were awarded to consultancy firm McKinsey and Company from January 2011 to September of 2023, finding a, quote, frequent disregard for the rules. With us now to respond to that report is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister who oversees those contracts, the Minister of Procurement, Charles Sousa. Hi, Mr. Sousa. Great to have you here in studio. Thanks for making the time.
Great to be here.
Can you see how Canadians would read this report and basically come to the conclusion that your government doesn't care about getting value for taxpayer dollars?
Well, I do appreciate the Auditor General's report. We thank her for what she's done on this report and some others, right? We've initiated a number of them in the past, recognizing that there were some deficiencies that we wanted to correct, recognizing that we wanted to have a sense of what has happened since 2011, which also includes times during the Conservative government. But Canadians, and myself included, we are concerned. We want transparency. We want to make certain that there is proper procedures taken in place to do procurement and not contracts.
I want to be clear to the audience that you're right. This did look into the process under the former government, under then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And the Auditor General came to the conclusion that the disregard for rules happened under both governments, but that the spending was much greater under the Trudeau government beginning in 2019. So of about $200 million that was spent, $8.6 million happened under the Conservative government. The rest happened under your government.
In regards to McKinsey.
Yes, in regards to McKinsey, which is the specifics of this report. You pointed to, there's been other reports that she's done lately that also talk about a lack of value for money. And I want to be specific. In this one, she said in 19 of the 33 contracts she looked at, she couldn't figure out if the government got value for money. Why? Because of a failure to show why a contract was necessary, no clear statement of what the contract would deliver, and a lack of confirmation that government received all expected deliverables. How in the world can hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars be spent and that information not be readily available?
So the majority of these were done also prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic. A lot of things were taken expeditiously to get things done. There was also what's called a national standard offer that was provided for McKinsey, and that has since expired and has not been renewed, but it allowed for certain procedures to take place to expedite matters. But that's a concern. And a lot of that, what has been highlighted, has also been implemented and corrected. We've taken the measures necessary to ensure that there's transparency, to ensure that there's proper measures, and also to ensure that there's integrity in the system, because we are concerned about that as was the Auditor General.
Isn't it fair for Canadians to conclude there is not integrity? And doesn't responsibility lie with your government? I sort of get the sense that all the ministers talking about it today are like, well, oh yeah, this is terrible. The bureaucrats, the departments, there were processes in place. Ultimately, your government oversees all of this. Why aren't you ensuring that every penny of money Canadians give you is spent in a valuable way?
So we're talking about an historic issue, right? These things are things that have happened. These things are things that...
So they're never going to happen again?
Well, we're taking every step to make sure that it doesn't, and recognizing that the majority of those contracts, the McKinsey contracts, they represent 0.27% of the entire amount of contracts that are in the system.
Because you've grown, the number and the size of those contracts is substantial.
And because there's been a lot of measures that have taken place to increase our economic activity, to invest in the things that we needed, to also fight for the pandemic during that period of time. Yeah, but we are concerned. And we are ensuring that measures are taken. So a lot of the recommendations made by the Auditor General and the Ombudsman have already been initiated. And one of the recommendations today, there's a number that she cited that she had already noted in the past, but the only new one was around the conflicts of interest and the disclosure of such. And those things we started to implement as well. And what the good recommendation out of that is that she wants it to be unified across all agencies, not just within the procurement through PSPC, to standardize that from every agency. I think that's a great idea.
Isn't it interesting, though, that she didn't make a lot of new recommendations? She actually said in her press conference she hesitated to make any because there are rules that exist. They just weren't being followed. So if if the problem isn't the rules that exist, but rather the enforcement of them, the fact that the public service is not following them, again, does the responsibility not lie with your government? And I don't understand how, if this were your first year or second year, sure, you've been in power for 9 years.
Well, I'm not advocating the responsibility. We are taking the responsibility. That's why we've initiated the actions that we've taken. And you're right, there are matters that weren't followed. Corrective measures were taken. Disciplinary measures were taken. Obviously, there was no elected and no consequence of interference by elected officials.
She said no ministerial political involvement.
And because these are the minister himself has taken the initiative since he became minister about a year now or 6 months ago to modernize the system, to protect the integrity of the procurement process, to ensure that all of it is followed properly. Notwithstanding the few that are cited here, we might make sure that all of it throughout the subject.
Just to be sure, it's not a few. 70% of the McKinsey contracts alone were sole sourced.
There's 400,000 contracts done. McKinsey represent 0.2%. There's $1 billion in activity through procurement. So
sure.
we do know that and McKinsey, the value for money audit that you were explaining, part of it is that she couldn't really assess what that value for money was because she needed to have understanding of the intent.
How could that information not be made available to her?
No, I get it. And that's why we're taking those measures to ensure that people understand the value for money, as all of us want, right? And so, and McKinsey is reputable. I mean, they're a worldwide organization that have done a lot of work, but we go around and make certain that the work they do for Canadians and for Canada is of value.
And I want to ask you about the elephant in the room with respect to that, because, and I want to be clear again, the Auditor General said there was no ministerial direction provided. Right. But you know what the opposition is saying and what they did when Radio Canada first reported this, I think it was over a year ago, that prompted a lot of the evaluation that the AG did, that Dominic Barton, who was the former managing partner of McKinsey, also served as the head of the Economic Advisory Council to then Finance Minister Bill Morneau. That council recommended, for example, massive increases to immigration. Radio Canada's analysis showed that about 44% of federal contracts issued to McKinsey came in the departments of the CBSA and immigration. The implication through the vis-a-vis the opposition was that there's something that smells weird here, that there's, did Dominic Barton have anything to do with this? Let me ask you bluntly.
So if you look at the overall degree of contracts that were negotiated, McKinsey is a very small portion, extremely small relative to everything else that has been done in procurement. And there are requirements for RFPs and requests. The issue here is that there was a standard offer that was national for McKinsey, and that has expired and it has not continued. And I think that was important to assess. But McKinsey, in the overall scheme of things, is actually a very small participant in the overall procurement process for our government.
So just to be blunt, though, this had nothing to do with Dominic Barton. Let me ask you point blank.
No, I don't. Dominic Barton certainly is an individual of some consequence, but he didn't have anything to do with regards to these procurements, as far as I understand.
I just have time for one final question, and I wanted it to kind of be on the broader issue for Canadians. In the budget 2023, your government pledged to decrease the amount of spending on consultants writ large. In 2015, you actually said you wanted to look at that and start doing it. The exact opposite happened. Consultants have gone up by spending on consultants, I should say, has gone up by 88% since you first came into office. The public service has grown by something in the neighborhood of 60% in that same period. Should your government be looking at spending a lot less, cutting a lot more than 15% on consultants, particularly when Canadians are seeing ArriveCan, Indigenous contracting, and now this one, and basically a blatant, lack of value for taxpayer money?
Well, a lack of value that she couldn't assess. But you're right to suggest that we have to look at alternatives. And the President of the Treasury Board, that's part of our mandate, to find savings in the system and to make it more effective and more efficient. And that's being done. It's funny because in committee, on the one hand, you have the NDP that are saying, hey, you're not contracting enough, you're not hiring enough staff to do the work. Because there is a lack of skills and disciplines necessary to deal with the issues around the procurement process for ArriveCan and IT. And the opposition complain that we're not doing it as well, when in fact the contracts that are established require for subcontracting, and that's part of the problem that they're assessing. And we have to make certain that that is also done.
I'm not a member of either of those parties. I'm just asking on behalf of Canadians, do you need to look at a further reduction in consultant spending when so much of the money that has been spent, and not just this report, but other reports show that it is impossible to determine if we're getting any value for the money we're putting into those contracts.
We're absolutely looking at that. We need to ensure that value for money is being had, that we need to ensure that transparency is there. We need to ensure integrity exists. We need to ensure that training and skills are required for our civil service who are doing the work. And believe me, a lot of them are doing excellent work. And they had to do a lot of extraordinary work the pandemic to facilitate and move forward on things more quickly than is ever anticipated. And that, too, was part of the problem.
I'm going to leave it on that note. Mr. Sousa, I appreciate you coming in and for the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Charles Sousa is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Procurement.